Hello and welcome to another Science Book Club, where I have no idea what I'm doing and neither do my guests. Playing the part of Deer in the Headlights this week is Ella Wang, a Bachelor of Philosophy student at the Australian National University. Ella, thanks for joining me.
Thank you.
So, you're working on stellar spectra,
Yes.
right? Can you tell me a bit about what you're doing?
So basically, when we observe stars, and we can only observe stars, unfortunately we can't take a scoop of a star, we can see a lot of different lines in the stars. And this is kind of like the stellar fingerprint, where you can look at these lines and you can identify what sort of elements are inside the stars. Now, being able to identify these is not easy. You can't just measure how deep the line is and say, this is how much of an element there is. Unfortunately, we mostly use a synthetic spectra, so fake ones, to kind of mimic what we should see, and then from our fake spectra we can tell what is actually really the composition of the star.
Okay, so you've got to make these fake spectra from what we know about these elements in the lab, and so what we expect to see, and then that gives you, and so the strength of the dip gives you the amount of that element in the star.
Yeah, pretty much. So basically we just simulate all the stellar physics of like, here's a star and this is some convection layers happening, and then you also have in the atmosphere sort of what should you see from the surface of the star.
Right, okay. So the books we've got this week are a bit of an astronomy theme.
Good luck.
Okay. So the books we've got this week are a bit of an astronomy theme. I've got Lisa Harvey Smith's When Galaxies Collide, and Ella's going to be talking about the Percy Jackson series. So that's not a series I've read, so I know that's about Greek mythology, but that's the extent of my knowledge. So what's the Percy Jackson series about?
So it's basically about putting Greek mythology in a modern day setting, in America in particular. The idea is basically kind of like your modern day fantasy story, where you have a lot of modern day things in it, like coast trips and holidays and camps from high school, but you also have Greek gods mixed in with it as well, and magic.
So is Percy Jackson sort of Hercules, or
so Hercules was a son of Zeus, if I remember correctly. No, so Percy Jackson is the son of Poseidon in the story, and he was born very recently, so it's a modern day.
Okay, but so he meets all those characters like Poseidon and Zeus, and does battle with them, and
sometimes I think he mostly does battle with Ares.
So the crisis of the story is a battle between gods, or is it more like he's a teenage boy, he's got all the usual teenage boy problems, he's trying to go out with girls, meanwhile Poseidon's saying, no, you've got to come and rule the ocean?
No, so it's more like what in Greek mythology demigods used to do. So fight all the monsters, keep the peace between the Olympian family, and go on quests that the gods sent them on, fulfill prophecies, that sort of stuff.
And is the story sort of closely tied to the original Greek myths?
They do mention the original Greek myths, and the Greek gods still do have the same personalities, and they still rule the same domains. So pretty much, but there's also a bit more sort of witty modern day humor in it, added to it. So.
A lot of astronomy is from the ancient Greek and Roman myths, and so is there a connection between the books for you for astronomy?
I don't think the books in particular mention any astronomy in them. However, I do think that the books definitely inspired me a little bit to study astronomy. In particular, looking at the stars in the night sky, because you see all these stars and you have all these constellations, and they're called all these Greek names. But knowing the stories of the Greek myths behind these people that the stars were named after. It's quite interesting, and I find it a lot easier to remember what they're called and their stories if I have the sort of context and background. And in particular, I do enjoy Greek mythology and just mythology in general. So
I was really into Greek and Roman mythology, which is basically the same thing, isn't it?
Yeah.
When I was in late primary school, early high school, and I saw the connections with the stars, it does make it a lot easier to remember them, and remember, if you know the story behind that star or that constellation, makes it a lot easier. For all my teaching stuff, really all I remember is Orion and the Southern Cross. Orion's my teaching constellation because it's got a bunch of stuff in it, and I don't know much about any of the other constellations, but But you know more constellations and can tell the stories of like Scorpio and things like that.
Yeah, pretty much. So, like Orion is the hunter, and he was in the stars because he died hunting a scorpion because he was chasing after Artemis or Diana in Roman myth, the goddess of the moon, who was a sworn eternal maiden. So you have all these stories, and there's also how the bull, what's the bull called again?
Taurus.
Yeah, no, so it's a V constellation, which is also, it's an upside down bull head, I think. Which is between Pleiades, the Seven Sisters, and Orion. So you have the bull protecting the Seven Sisters from Orion the Hunter. So you can come up with all these stories, and the reason why Orion is in the summer night sky and Scorpion is in the winter night sky is because they're opposites, because they used to hunt each other, so they separated them in the sky. So you have all these sort of stories and ways to remember how, when and where constellations rise. So yeah, it's pretty interesting.
When I was doing my PhD, I got to teach first year astronomy unit, and we would work a little bit of Aboriginal astronomy, Aboriginal Australian astronomy into that. And that was fascinating because there are a lot of stories that are different between tribes across Australia, or there's a story particular to a region. Some of them spread across Australia, but the general stories of the Orion constellation, they're always hunters of some sort. Some of the Aboriginal tribes and family groups and regions within Australia have something very similar to the Greek myth of Orion. Some of them it's the 3 stars in the belt, they're 3 brothers in a boat who are fishing, and the Orion Nebula is the fish. Okay. But it's always something hunting. But a lot of them have him as this giant male hunter in the sky. And they have the story of him chasing the 7 sisters of the Pleiades. So you can sort of see, if you watch the stars over the night, why that might be, because as the stars go across the sky in the night, the Pleiades precede Orion, so it sort of looks like he's chasing them. So either there's this thing in our genetics that, or just our makeup as humans, that we tend to make these very similar stories or very similar connections in these patterns, or it means something much deeper, because the Aborigines have been on this continent for 60,000 years at least, probably longer, closer to 80,000 years. It potentially means that these hunter stories of Orion are 100,000 years old. And a lot of cultures throughout the world have this hunter story of Orion, and there's this very distinct possibility of there being these 100,000-year-old ancient stories connecting across cultures. And that's something I always found fascinating, that I learnt from teaching a bit of Aboriginal astronomy, how it ties in with the Greek and all the other ancient cultures. It's fascinating. So what did you like about the Percy Jackson books? Why are they the book series you're recommending today?
I think as a kid, I really, really enjoyed reading fantasy. In particular fantasy, because it's so removed from just our everyday life, and you can just come up with crazy worlds where you can do whatever you want and live the life that you want. I think that's kind of the appeal of fantasy for most people. And I like that it still ties back into modern day a little bit, where you kind of escape to camp for a while and then you come back to your daily life. And it's very similar in terms of that with the Harry Potter series, where you kind of escape to Hogwarts for a while and then you have to come back into your real life. So I think that kind of taught me where it's good to take breaks, but also at the end of the day you have to come back and still do the things that you're meant to do. The other thing that I really liked about it is the fact that I got to learn a lot of Greek mythology from it. So I know everyone who's read the book has always said that they learned quite a lot of Greek mythology and Roman mythology from the sequel afterwards, and perhaps Egyptian mythology from the Kane Chronicles by the same author. And I really enjoyed reading those stories, and it was a good gateway into sort of reading the more Greek mythology traditional stories that were translated from Greek, because those contain a lot more difficult concepts and words because they were written by the ancients. So it was a good gateway because I was very young when I read them, and I think that definitely piqued my interest and it got me to actually engage in Greek mythology a lot more.
Yeah. Who's the author of the series?
Rick Riordan. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right.
I'll check. Okay. So moving on from ancient astronomy to modern astronomy, Lisa Harvey-Smith is now, she was an Australian-British radio astronomer at the CSIRO. She's since left there to become a Women in STEM ambassador, I think. So I think she's left recently. This is her first book, When Galaxies Collide. She's done things like Stargazing Live with Brian Cox, so that's how she's got into this. This book is not just about the galaxies and astronomy and how we know what we know about the way the universe works. This is also the story of her life as an astronomer. It starts back when she was a kid, going camping with her parents and friends in Britain. And so it's very much about her life as well as the astronomy. And so that's what I found very interesting about this, because as well as learning about astronomy, so if you read this book, you will get a very good introduction to astronomy, to the galaxy evolution, galactic dynamics, how we have learned how our universe has evolved since the Big Bang to form galaxies, to form stars like our sun that can support life, that have planets that support life. So I appreciated that she delves into how we know this, not just that we know it, but also because it was about her life growing up. So for me, there weren't the parallels growing up, but because I have gone and worked on some of the telescopes she talks about in this book, that was where I felt the greatest connection. She talks about going to the Murchison Radio Observatory, the Narrabri Observatory, so the Paul Wild Observatory outside Narrabri, the Australia Telescope Compact Array. So those are two observatories I've got to go to, and so she talks about going to those and the experience she had there. And I had very similar experiences talking to the astronomers and engineers who work out there. I didn't have to deal with snakes, but I had to deal with other animals getting in the way during my time out at those observatories. I had to deal with floods at the Murchison. She didn't have to deal with that. So for me, there was a very strong human connection. And what I got from this book was that if you are a student or a high school student or a university student who's thinking about maybe getting into astronomy, so someone who, like where you were a couple of years ago, thinking about getting into astronomy, what does astronomy involve? Is astronomy right for me? This is a very good book. This gives you a good idea of what it's like to be an astronomer, or particularly a radio astronomer, but a very good idea of what the field of astronomy is like today. And if you enjoy this book, if you read this book, enjoy the science, enjoy the experiences and the life that Lisa Harvey-Smith has had, then astronomy is probably the right field for you. That's what I got out of this book. It's very well written. It's a very pleasant read. There's a lot of interesting stuff in it. She's got to meet Apollo astronauts, Brian Cox, Star O'Brien, those kind of guys from doing things like Stargazing Live. She's had a very exciting life, somewhat envious. And Brian Cox is one of the reviewers of the book. Brian Cox himself says, a fascinating and inspiring tour of the galaxies illuminated by vivid and often humorous accounts of the day-to-day life of an astronomer. I completely agree with that assessment. So you got this book the same day I did. We both went to the launch of this book.
Yes.
You haven't had a chance to read it yet.
No, I haven't gone around to it. The launch was, what, a month or two ago?
A month or two? Hold on.
Maybe a bit longer.
Lisa signed it for me, 1st of August, so...
Oh, okay, that's a bit longer.
Yeah, a bit longer ago. Get on with it.
I'll read it eventually. Yeah, so it's been a busy month because I recently had exams and I had a bunch of other stuff. And I'm currently doing a summer scholarship, and I recently went to visit the AAT at Siding Spring Observatories and the Parkes Telescope. Which is located, what's the town called?
Parkes.
Parkes.
That's why it's called Parkes.
Damn it. Yeah, so we had nice people who gave us a tour of their facilities, and we were there for the night to observe on AAT. However, there was a dust storm, so we couldn't see anything. But the really cool thing was we got to stand on the catwalk on top of the AAT whilst the dust storm hit us, and you could really hear the winds just pick up a few minutes before the dust storm hit. So yeah, there's some really cool experiences in astronomy.
I've been out on the catwalk on the AAT. So it was the Anglo-Australian Telescope. Is it still called that? Because
yes.
because the British are no longer part of it. So It's great. It used to be the Anglo-Australian Observatory. Now it's the Australian Astronomical Observatory. Then they don't have to change the letterheads on anything. It's just still AAO. But, so it's still the Anglo-Australian Telescope. Okay.
Maybe? I don't remember. They didn't mention a name change to me.
Yeah, but that's one of the telescopes Lisa's been out to for things like Stargazing Live. She's also got to go to Parkes. I'm jealous of both of you. I've never got to go to Parkes. Parkes is one of the big Australian telescopes that I did not get to go to during my PhD, so I'm going to have to go out there as just a pleb and see it for myself sometime.
You could email one of the people there to give you a tour.
That's true, that's
Yeah.
true. I used to work on radio telescopes, please give me a That's what we did for the AAT. We were nearby for other telescopes,
Yeah.
like Mopra and Narrabri, and my supervisor emailed and said, could we get a tour of the telescope? Yeah, sure. So I went out on the catwalk, and I have a bit of a fear of heights, so I'm clamping onto the side, just no one make any sudden movements. How are you?
We actually all clambered out on the catwalk, all of the summer scholars, and I asked the person observing if they could rotate the telescope dome whilst we were on it, so we could like capture a 360-degree rotation with our cameras,
Oh.
whilst the telescope rotated for us. He couldn't do 360, but he did 180 for us. It was really cool and exciting. I don't think you would have liked that.
I probably would have been good after the first few seconds. Okay, we're moving, nothing's falling down, I'm good. I want to go in the dish in Parkes. I've been in the dishes in the Narrabri telescopes. I haven't been in the dish in Parkes. Did you get to go in the dish?
Unfortunately, we didn't get to go on the dish because NASA had hired the dish and they were tracking Voyager 2.
Probably.
Yeah, pretty sure it was Voyager 2 at the time. So we got to see the signal from Voyager 2, which is actually just one massive spike and then two small spikes on the side. So it's basically a radio signal. But they hired Parkes, even though Parkes is a functional scientific telescope and makes scientific discoveries all the time. But they hired Parkes because all the other telescopes were booked out because of the New Horizons
Yep.
mission. And on the last, they also went to Tidbinbilla, which is where the Canberra Deep Space Centre is. And they actually have a bigger dish there. It's bigger than
Yeah.
Parkes. Yeah, but it doesn't look like it because of the perspective, because you're not allowed to get close to it because it's owned by CSIRO and NASA and
So
people.
Parkes is 64 metres, Tidbinbilla's 70.
Yeah.
But it's based on the same design.
Yeah.
So Parkes was used to track the Apollo missions as they went to the moon.
Mhm.
And so the basic Parkes telescope design was used to design the big dishes at the 3 deep space centres around the world. So it's a very, very similar design. Basically, it's Parkes technology. And so designed by Barnes Wallis, one of my engineering heroes. So it's great because Parkes works so well. We are just going to take this design, make it slightly bigger, and run with it.
Yeah.
So again, Tidbinbilla is only something I've been out to as a tourist. I haven't gone out to see the dish. So did you get to go to the dish, or did you have to stay back from it?
They
in the
don't
visitor
allow
centre?
anyone to go to the dish,
Ah.
so it was really sad, but it was all right. It was still really cool to see sort of what it was tracking because they had a little TV screen
Yeah.
to show you what it was tracking at the time. I think when we went there, they were tracking the Spitzer space telescope,
Right.
space station.
It's a telescope. It's a telescope.
Yeah. And they were going to track New Horizons next, but we left slightly before that.
Aw.
So
So I think Lisa talks about the Deep Space Centre. I think she's been out there during things like Stargazing Live, but Parkes, because she's was a CSIRO astronomer, that's one she's worked with closely. So having not been out to Parkes, but knowing her descriptions of Narrabri and the Murchison Radio Observatory, I'm sure it's a very accurate description. It's probably the closest I'm going to come to getting there for a while and getting to see that telescope.
sure, you can find some time to go.
I know it's not as far away. I used to live on the other side of the country, 3,000 kilometres away. So it's a lot closer now than it used to be, but now I just need to find time to go out there. How far away is it? Like 3 hours?
Roughly 3 hours to 4
3 hours drive,
hours.
okay.
If you make no stops along the way, then it's about 3 hours.
Right, okay.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's a day trip or a weekend thing. You know.
Speed.
Shh. Yeah. So for budding young astronomers, if you think astronomy might be right for you, read this book. If you still like it at the end, astronomy's for you. And if you like Greek mythology and fantasy, read Percy Jackson. Ella, thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
We'll see you next time.
Bye.